Hi folks, this is Chase again, Dr. Steele if you're feeling formal. We're going to go ahead and take a crack at Chapter 2, and rather than try to go through the entire chapter, I'm going to highlight the two major models that we're going to pay attention to. And in this first portion of the lecture, we're going to deal with the PPF. The PPF is one of the simplest models that you're going to find, and it's got some very, very limiting assumptions. It's going to assume that there are only two goods, the time horizon is limited, resources are fixed in quality and quantity, and that technology is fixed. And you might be asking yourself, those seem pretty restrictive. Why would you ever do that? What we're essentially trying to capture is a snapshot of an economy. And we're going to try to limit it down to its most bare essentials so that we can highlight some real basic relationships between scarcity and trade-offs, and even talk a little bit about growth. So let's go ahead and just get started. I think one of the easiest ways is to just take a look at the model. So let's assume two goods. The classic example is guns and butter. And these could be any two goods. Later on we'll relax the assumption a little bit and talk about two different types of goods. But let's start out with particulars at first. Guns and butter, and we're going to draw in this bowed out curve. This bowed out curve is actually our frontier. And the frontier is showing us that there are limitations to what we can produce within the economy. If we're making sure that all of our resources are actively employed, then we're going to be out here on the curve. And we have choices about how many guns we want, or how much butter we want. But if we're actually using all of our resources and not letting any of them sit around idle, you can't have more of both. What we're going to find out is that if in fact you sit here at point A and you would like to get more butter, you could get down here to point B, which clearly has more butter. But in order to get down here to point B, you are going to have to give up some guns. So the most basic concept that the PPF captures for us is that, one, scarcity exists. And you might ask yourself, well, how does it capture that? The point of there being a line captures it, because it's implying that you can't have unlimited guns and butter. You have constraints that you're dealing with. And scarcity also is going to force us into trade-offs, i.e. if you want more butter, you're going to end up giving away or foregoing some guns. That trade-off there, in order to get this butter, we ended up losing some guns. This is in fact what economists refer to as an opportunity cost. When we choose more butter, we end up giving up guns, which would have been our next best alternative. That's going to be important for us later on. So I want you to keep that concept in mind. It'll figure in prominently when we talk about comparative advantage. So we've got a couple of things going for us. We've got scarcity. We've been able to model that. We've also been able to highlight the fact that scarcity forces us into trade-offs. And the last thing I want to do for the basics of this model is talk about why we refer to it as a frontier. Now, I don't know about you, but when I think about the frontier, I think about the edges of civilization or the edges of what are possible. And that's exactly what this model is trying to capture. Essentially, being out on the frontier implies that you're doing everything that you possibly could. So, points out here, we are going to refer to as unattainable. And points inside, we are going to refer to as inefficient. Inefficient in the sense that we have some resources that we're obviously not using well. So, you got three basic regions. Inside, you have inefficient use of resources. Anywhere on the line, you have no idle resources, and we're going to refer to that as efficient. And then anywhere outside, we're going to talk about as currently unattainable. Okay, So we've got the basics of the model more or less taken care of. Let's talk about some ways in which we can expand what we can do with this model. So previously we've been drawing guns and butter. Another way that we can sort of broaden out the usefulness of this model is to talk about two different types of goods. We can talk about capital goods, which I'm going to label with a K, and consumption goods, which I'm going to label with a C. Capital goods you can think of as goods that are manufactured and are going to help us produce other goods later. Consumption goods you can think about as things like shirts, cereal, video games, things that we're going to consume up in this period but aren't going to be of any particular use for producing more goods in the future. Now, one of the things that we can start to talk about once we broaden this out is we can start to discuss what does it mean if a society changes from one bundle of goods to another. In other words, what if we were to go from A to B? Now, the model doesn't necessarily pass any judgments on which bundle is correct. In that sense, you could say that it's a reflection of positive analysis. But if you started to ask about what are the differences between A and B, I hope that you could tell me that it's pretty obvious here that B has a higher amount of capital than A does. And if capital is going to be useful for making other goods, then fundamentally moving from A to B seems like it should impact what you're capable of. In other words, it should be able to change the frontier itself. And in fact, that's what we'd expect to see. If you have more capital goods, then we are now more capable, and our frontier, our possibilities of what we can produce, is definitely going to go out. And we're going to see that by moving this curve out. What we've done here is actually modeled another basic element from economics. Not only can we show scarcity and trade-offs, we can also show economic growth. And this economic growth is evidenced by the PPF moving out in space. In similar fashion, we can also talk about things that would change our overall possibilities. In order to do that, we need to loosen up some of our other assumptions. Once again, with capital and consumption goods, it's entirely possible that we end up finding more oil. We could find more deposits of precious metals or even normal metals like tin. We might have more people that are born and enter the labor force. All of these things would change our abilities to produce, and you could show all of these as a shift out in the PPF. Now, sometimes you'll find things like iron ore deposits, and iron ore deposits might be a little bit better at helping us produce capital goods than they are consumption goods. So it's okay if we move the PPF out in a way that privileges capital goods over consumption goods, or reflects the fact that we are now more able in that area than in others. It's also possible that we can measure, or not measure, we can reflect technological changes. If we find a better way of doing things, like when they figured out how to make steel with the Bessemer process in the late 1800s, that was going to be something that was hugely useful for capital goods and also probably for some consumption goods. But they essentially could start making steel at rates that they'd never been able to before. So you could think about this movement out of the PPF being caused by resources, where we were discovering iron ore over here, or over here by figuring out a better way of using that iron ore to turn it into steel with the Bessemer process, a technological improvement. Either one of these are actually going to be able to move the PPF out. Now, it's entirely possible that the PPF could move in. You could lose resources, you could have a plague that killed off, tons of people. Anything that destroys your possibilities permanently would, of course, move the PPF in. Now, what I don't want you to make the mistake of doing is moving the PPF in if you have something like a general strike. So when the Grecian citizens recently were angry at their government and they decided that they were going to go on strike and not work, you might be tempted to move the PPF in. Don't do that. You just need to make a movement inside of the curve, inside of the frontier. Because what you're actually showing with a point inside here is that we are not effectively using all of our resources at the moment. But it's not like we've forgotten how to work. Society, for whatever reason, has chosen not to do that. So here are some of your basic shifts that you can see within the PPF. And of course, both of these would also be considered ways in which you could grow the economy. Okay, and one last thing with the PPF. Let's go ahead and use the PPF to model some policy changes. Oh wow, geez, sorry, that looks terrible. There we go, policy changes. You ever pay attention during presidential elections? They're pretty consistently telling you how they're going to get the economy to grow. Usually they talk about this as a jobs plan or some sort of thing like that. You can model some of these basic ones, like the Republican plan. The Republicans for quite some time have always suggested that they can get the economy to go by lowering taxes. So why would they possibly think that this is going to get the economy to grow? The idea, of course, is that they're going to lower taxes on rich folks, and when rich folks have more money, they're not just going to sit on it, they're going to look to do something useful with it, is the idea. And the hope is that they invest in capital. So what the Republican plan is largely driving at is trying to force, through taxation, a change in the way that we're using our resources, putting a little bit more money into capital investment. And of course, that's where they're thinking that they're going to get that growth from. So you have a Republican plan there. Another way that you could look at this is, or another example of this, is you could look at perhaps Clinton. And I mean Bill Clinton, not Hillary. Bill Clinton fancied himself somewhat of an education president. And he thought that, investment in education was really an important thing for driving the economy. And if we were to try to talk about that in the context of the PPF, we'd have to understand it as him trying to improve the resources that the economy has to work with. If we have much more highly trained folks, more skilled folks, then it stands to reason that they should be able to produce more than unskilled and untrained workers. So you get sort of a democratic education platform, or they might refer to it as a human capital platform, improving the resources that we have to work with. So as you can see, our little PPF actually does quite a few things for us. We can show scarcity, the fact that we're forced into trade-offs when scarcity is present. We can model growth with it, and we can also model basic policy changes or policy proposals. Our next topic that we're going to deal with is comparative advantage. And what we're going to find with comparative advantage is that it's possible to escape the PPF if you're willing to engage in trade with other nations. So we'll look at that in our next installment.